Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests to continue our ISA series. I'm here with Daniel Pianko of University Ventures and Andy Hall of the San Diego Workforce Partnership. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thrilled to be here.
Thanks so much, Erik.
Dan, why don't we start with you a bit? You think a lot about the context of the workforce crises in America. Why don't you expound a little bit on your thinking there and how you think ISAs might be helpful?
Thanks, Erik. We have one of the biggest social problems in this country is how disconnected so many Americans feel from economic security. You know, we have a society where the gig economy has grown, which is wonderful for so many, but it leaves a lot of people without health care, without a sense of career, without a sense of purpose, without a sense of what's next besides the next Uber ride or the next pickup. And the reason for that is because we have this massive chasm between education, where we go to learn, and employment, where we go to work and seek that career. In fact, of the 100 people who start college, so not everybody starts college, right? But of the 100 people who start college, only about 50 graduate. And of those, only about half of those, so about 25% of people who start college end up graduating and getting a job that they use their college degree for. So this is how we're left with this image of the college graduate, diploma in hand, working at Starbucks or another, gig economy type job. And this is really a problem because the result is you don't have the opportunity. If you don't get a good first job, then you're very likely to never get a good job. So of those people those 25% who don't get a good first job, these people are about 50% likely 5 years later to still be underemployed. And then if you're underemployed, the answer from society is go back to school, go back to college where you were unsuccessful. And you know what? If you're unsuccessful once, you're probably not going to be successful again. And especially when the cost of college has risen so fast and so dramatically, 2 times the rate of inflation, you're leaving an institution with a lot of debt and a limited number of employment opportunities. And so we've got this disconnect not between what you learn and your job, but also the cost of that education and the ultimate return on that investment. And that's really at the heart of, I think, a lot of the societal problems we're plagued with today, and where we think there needs to be a new generation of pathways and connectivity that tie the value of education to the ultimate job market.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that a bunch. But Andy, why don't you first start by talking about some of the current infrastructure we have to address this crisis that Daniel just outlined, and maybe you describe what a workforce board is and what your work is.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Erik. And Daniel's certainly right. Here in San Diego, we're a county of about 3.5 million people, and our economy is booming. Unemployment is almost below 3% for the first time in almost forever. And businesses tell us the only thing holding them back further, or the largest thing holding them back, is access to skilled talent. At the same time, San Diego and the state of California, when adjusted for cost of living, has the highest poverty rate of any state, so almost 20%. So 1 in 5 families are living below the poverty line when adjusted for cost of living, even though the majority of those families actually have one full-time working adult. So there's just a fundamental disconnect between wages and cost of living and business growth and the opportunities in San Diego. So there actually is, as you mentioned, a public investment in trying to solve this problem. It's called the Public Workforce System. And we at the San Diego Workforce Partnership, the organization that I'm the chief operating officer of, we're funded in part by the federal government to do some of the work to address this skills gap. And there's 550 or so other workforce boards all across the country. All told, we serve about 25,000 people a year. And over the last 45 years, served hundreds of thousands of people. What we're seeing and what we're struggling to adjust to, which will give us kind of context into the income share agreements as we get into it, is that the public workforce system is kind of fundamentally set up in a transactional way. It was The current version of it is there's career centers or one-stop career centers all across the county of San Diego. We operate 6 of them. And all of the funding and financing from the federal government and the measures and regulations that are attached to it are really built on a concept of a transactional approach to solving the skills debt, where, someone comes in, we try to dust up their resume and then send them to some job boards and send them on their way. Well, the fundamental disconnect between the jobs that are being created and the skills that people have, that actually doesn't work. Fundamentally, the skills that people are being laid off from, or the jobs that people are being laid off from, don't fundamentally connect with the new jobs that are being created. And by and large, and I think there's pockets, and we'll talk about some here shortly, the public infrastructure hasn't caught up with this new reality where we can't be just transactional, and we've got to be thinking about how do we fundamentally make short and long-term investments in a transformational way to help workers connect with the jobs of the future.
Awesome. Going back to some of the problems that you both have addressed, Daniel, let's start with you. What's the big idea with ISAs in terms of how they help solve some of the problems you outlined or address them?
The big idea is that we need to figure out a way to reduce what we call education friction, right? Right now, when someone is misplaced in the job market, the way Andy described, they don't have the skills for the labor force that's moved. They look at college tuition and they see a big number. I mean, could you imagine you're underemployed, you're unhappily employed, and there's 7 million unfilled jobs out there, and that there's a career out there. Yet at the same time, you're faced with the price tag of college, which is, $30,000 for a program or, $1,000 a credit hour. These numbers are insurmountable for most Americans, especially Americans who find themselves on the wrong end of the skills gap in the 21st century. And so what ISAs do is it almost acts like an insurance policy. It says to somebody, look, we know the system hasn't worked for you in the past. We're going to say to you, go back to school, and this is in the workforce context, right? Go back to school. If you and the income share agreement will pay for you to go back to school. If you do really well, you pay a percentage of your income. If school doesn't work for you or the workforce training doesn't work for you and you graduate and you make less than a certain amount, then you don't owe anything. And this allows someone to take the risk of going back to school. Now, again, just put yourself, it's hard for probably many of the listeners to your podcast to think about what it would be like. You are working in a low wage job in order to, pay your cell phone bill, to struggle to pay your bills every month. You're not just stopping working. Most Americans have, if you go back to school, it's a big work effort. You're not going to be able to do as many Uber shifts. You're not going to be able to do, take care of your kids as much. You're taking, time is such a valuable asset on top of the money that you have to spend. And what ISAs do is they really reduce the education friction. They say, we're going to insure you against the risk that that education doesn't work. This is one of the biggest investments that someone will make in their lifetime, besides maybe their house or maybe their cars. And to look at that investment and to not be guaranteed a job, right? Imagine you're looking out and you're thinking, I'm going to spend all this money. I'm going to take time away from my family. And at the end of the day, what's the percent likelihood that I'll actually get a job that will allow me to pay this back? And so the income share agreement really reallocates the risk away from the student and towards the university or the person funding the income share agreement. And so it really is a way to dramatically reduce the friction, what we call the education friction, from deciding to take that step to learn, to get the skills necessary for the 21st century economy.
Yeah, and picking up on what Daniel just said about risk, I mean, if you kind of think about American society over the last 60 or 70 years, there's been kind of a systemic shifting of risk away from corporations, institutions, and even away from government onto the individual and onto the American family, whether it's the decline in employer-paid pensions, it's the decline in unions, the increase in lending and consumer debt. And there's certainly opportunities there, but there's also more and more financial risk that families are bearing, including financing higher education to get good jobs in our society, where, you used to be able to get a free high school diploma, work really hard, and live a middle-class life. That increasingly in San Diego is not possible for the vast majority of our residents. And so you're taking on another piece of risk, which is financing your higher education to get the jobs that are driving San Diego's economic growth. But that's just one more piece of risk that we're asking American families to take on. And even in the gig economy and contract workers and the changing nature of employment is just one more iteration of how we're kind of pushing more and more risk onto the worker and to the family, because employers are going to offer less healthcare, and healthcare is now the responsibility of the family. So it's kind of in that world, with that trend of more and more risk going on to students, the idea of a student only paying if the higher education works for them and fundamentally transforms their earning potential resonates. It really, really resonates with the customers that we serve, because they're so used to having to bear all of the risk. To have an institution like the San Diego Workforce Partnership and our partners at UCSD or Purdue or University of Utah or the other institutions that are doing this in a responsible way, it really, really resonates with the customers that I've been speaking to.
Yeah, notice I use the word customer, right? I mean, this is, and especially when you think about and where ISAs I think are the most valuable, is where you have a direct return on investment for the program that you're doing. Usually when people want to finance their education, they're going either to the federal government or private lenders with student debt. And, we didn't talk about this, but there's $1.5 trillion of student debt. We hear every day the horror stories of debt. And one of the things we don't talk about enough is that student debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So it's not just the immediate risk. It's, this is, you could end up, I think there are something like 1 million people defaulting on our loans every year. And I think 100,000 of those are over 65. So this is risk, effectively, or debt that lives with you forever. This is what you're getting. This is your Social Security wages are going to be garnished. And some people are talking about free college. I'm not sure that really solves the problem, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not the free college we want. It's the job that gives us the ability to live a lifestyle that, a middle-class lifestyle in a place like San Diego or anywhere in the United States.
And you have a bit of a background with ISAs, Daniel. Can you outline that?
Yeah, so we at University Ventures were some of the first to I don't want to say discover ISAs, because really ISAs developed conceptually in the 1950s when Milton Friedman, the famous economist, said higher education has such disparate outcomes, and usually when you have disparate outcomes, you fund that with equity. When you know the cash flow you'll receive from an investment, you fund it with debt. But when you don't know what those outcomes are, or you have a very wide range of outcomes, then you should fund it with equity. And that's how he theorized that you should start something that he dubbed an income share agreement. I didn't know that when I went down this path, but I actually started my career in the financial institutions group at Goldman Sachs, where I was an investment banker to banks and worked on some student loan stuff. And then after the 2008 financial crisis, raised a small student debt fund. And I kind of then forgot about it, because I thought the student debt crisis would be fixed through the federalization of the loan program in 2000, through Obamacare in 2007 and 8, and that's a whole separate treatise. Until about 7 years later, when the front page of the New York Times, there was this article, and if something in the education world hits the front page of the New York Times, it's a very unique experience. And there's an article saying $1 trillion of student debt. And I said, what happened here to the student debt industry that I had been accustomed to? And wasn't the federal involvement in student loans supposed to bring down the amount of debt, save everybody money? And what I found was that the student debt, when we federalized the student debt and we made federal loans so much more available to so many people, what we did was basically open the floodgates. And the debt crisis was a result of these new programs. And I realized, but I was struggling with, okay, we got $1 trillion of debt, and today we've got 1.5 trillion. So this is just in the last 4 or 5 years. And I said, there's got to be a solution to this. And I'm an investor. Sometimes people call me a venture capitalist. And so I went around and I started trying to find what is the solution here? What could solve this problem in a sustainable way? And my associate, now partner, Anand Radia, met this company called Vimo Education in 2015 at a conference at the University of Pennsylvania, at Penn State. And there was such a genius in Tonio Di Sorrento, the founding CEO of Vimo. He went back to this concept of income share agreements, and he said he came up with some structural changes to how income share agreements had been postulated and considered in the past. There was an experiment in the 70s at Yale, and there have been a few experiments off and on. I think Andrew Lesson of Slow Ventures and some others have all sort of talked about income share agreements. But Tonio, who had been a lawyer to a number of fintech companies, including SoFi, he'd been at Oric, he said, hey, I've figured out the answer. And the answer is shared risk across a class of people. So like everybody who shows up at the workforce board, at Andy's workforce board, or every senior at Purdue. And I'm going to put in place a cap in terms of the amount you'll pay. So if you take out, $1,000 of ISAs, you'll never pay more than, say, $2,000. And a cap in terms of time, so that you'd never pay for more than, like, say, 5 years. And then what he also says, and there's got to be a minimum income threshold. And so he kind of recreated what is the modern day income share agreement. And I said, this is the answer. This concept of an income share agreement, and we led the seed round of Vimo a few months later, or actually participated first and then led a subsequent round. But what is kind of really interesting about what we saw was that Vimo would create a sustainable method for every stakeholder in the system, because students, it would de-risk the student education, lower their education friction, first of all. Second of all, it would create the right incentive structure for the educational institution, right? If students do really well after graduation, the cost of their income share agreement would go down. It would allow you to allocate risk, and schools could keep some element of risk. And then it really worked kind of from a societal perspective, because this was a way to lower the risk to the federal government by people actually engaging in training programs that would have a high enough return on investment that the income share agreement would make sense. And so we've seen this evolution in the market. And now with, I thought when Andrew Ross Sorkin wrote the front page article in the New York Times about it, we had sort of arrived, but now, we've got a great bipartisan bill in the Senate, Marco Rubio and Senator Young from the Republican side, and Senators Warren and Coons on the Democratic side, where this is really this income share agreement has the potential to remake student finance in this country. And so it's a really exciting period of time.
And let's double click there. Let's talk about the state of ISAs today, and more so, what are the biggest bottlenecks preventing them from taking off or becoming even more mainstream? What needs to happen?
The first most important thing is we need a legislative framework for what an ISA is. Right now, ISAs have been crafted by responsible institutions, as Andy said, like Purdue, like University of Utah, like University of California, San Diego, and that is great. But it's really important, as you think about the future of this industry, that we create some guardrails and some consumer protections, and that's why it was important. I think that Democrats and Republicans got together and said, this is a really interesting free market experiment, but there need to be guardrails to protect consumers. The second thing is the evolution of the capital markets, right? Today, and I think we should really talk about the role of philanthropy in that, but let me just start by saying the way you lower the cost of a good is to get it to scale. We all know this, and so we need to develop the capital markets at scale that can support this. And I think what's really driving that is income share agreements sort of really originated in the coding bootcamp space. And it's interesting because when ISAs hit the scene, first a couple coding bootcamps, Make School, App Academy, developed income share agreements. And pretty soon it was, if you didn't have an income share agreement, you couldn't run a coding boot camp, because everyone would say, okay, well, where's your ISA? Do you believe in your students, right? Do you believe in your program enough that the return on investment is high enough that, I should go to your school? And so schools started to get ISAs. And once one school got an ISA, everybody needed an ISA. And you got to the situation where if you didn't have an ISA, it meant you weren't really competitive in the market. That's going to start happening at the higher education levels. That's going to happen increasingly in skill development areas like that Andy's focused on. And so, if you show up with your parents in 5 years, right, and the school you're visiting for your college trip doesn't have an ISA, it means that maybe you're not going to get the economic return you want from that education. So ISA has become a real competitive tool for schools in attracting students. So I think it's really three things. One is the legislative infrastructure. That's clearly the most important. Two is sort of the capital markets. And three, the getting universities and more mainstream institutions to start leveraging ISAs in a responsible manner, such that it becomes a real way to demonstrate the value of what they're doing to their incoming students.
And I would just briefly add, I think for leaders of different higher education institutions and workforce training organizations like ours, I think we're going to continue to offer our core services. And I think ISAs are a really important tool to have to solve really specific problems. And I'll give you a few examples. So there's an application in Colorado with Colorado Mountain College where they're using ISAs with a small cohort of DACA recipients who otherwise are not eligible for federal aid in that state. So they're trying to get children of people working in the service industry opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't. For us, we are going to give federal grants to individuals with no requirement to repay through some of our federal funding for individuals who are experiencing homelessness, individuals coming out of the criminal justice system, which we have lots of programming in. And we're going to continue to do that. The specific challenge that we found is, as I mentioned, we serve about 25,000 people a year who are unemployed or have just been laid off and are making a career change. We've traditionally provided training scholarships for 2,500 of those 25,000. So someone might have been a construction worker, they were laid off, and we paid a short-term scholarship essentially with some of our federal funding, teach them how to do software development and then place them in coding. Well, over the last 10 years, our federal funding for that activity has been decreased by about 50%. Now, out of every 5 people who need that type of scholarship, we only have a federal grant to pay for them for every one of 5 people, so 20%. We're turning away 4 out of the 5 people who need to upgrade their skills to stay competitive in the labor market. We're just saying, you know what, maybe come back next year and we'll see if we have more money. And for me, kind of overseeing this system, that's just a completely unacceptable answer. I suppose we could also point them to private student loans and to other ways to finance it, but we don't think that was responsible either. So we were kind of stuck. And in fact, when I reviewed some of our customer satisfaction data, increasingly people who were unsatisfied with the services that they received at our career centers, and about 15% of them were. The majority of them were unsatisfied because they had done all the things that we told them to do. They took a career assessment to understand the growing jobs in San Diego and where they might need to upskill to get those jobs. They identified specific high quality schools that are on like a pre-approved list that we put together, and they created their career plan and they were all excited. And then we didn't have money to finance their next step. And that is crushing for the family, for businesses that need this talent. And so we said, we have to find another way. And that's when we stumbled on, actually it was an article in Forbes from Michael Horn, and he called it a renewable learning fund. And he wrote about how theoretically a renewable learning fund could transform workforce development for a couple of reasons. One, it would give us an option for those 4 out of every 5 people we were turning away to finance their higher education and through some short-term skills training. 2, it would kind of, the more successful we were, the more money we would have to continue to do what we're doing. And so it would be this virtuous cycle where, loans are not, and our federal job training programs are not structured that way. And three, it would give us radical visibility into the outcomes of our training investments, because through the ISA structure, we as a workforce board would be able to understand the employment outcomes over the 3, 4, 5-year term of the ISA, get for specific training providers, and those that fall to the bottom of the list on those outcomes over a long period of time, we would no longer finance them. And so it would be a market solution to driving high quality in the higher education, the kind of skills-based training space, which is something sorely needed, especially as kind of workforce boards go, because we don't have a ton of visibility into some of that performance after a year. So it was incredibly exciting for us to use ISAs to solve that specific problem. And I actually wrote Michael back and I said, hey, you know that article you wrote in 2016, I think it was, or 17, we actually raised some money and we did it. So thanks. And we're just starting out, and we'll see how the results come in as they're coming in shortly. But it is transformational for us, solving that specific problem that we had of more and more people need these training investments. And more often than not, we're turning them away and saying, maybe come back next year. Maybe it'll be different. And again, that's just unacceptable from our standpoint. And so ISAs represented a solution to that.
If I could jump in there, I think that what Andy is pioneering is a model across the entire educational ecosystem. When you give someone a grant, when you make a donation for a scholarship right now, and you say, hey, I'm going to pay for one kid to go to school, that's a one-shot deal. Think about like the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates gave $1 billion for to encourage first-generation people to go to school. And that's great for the people they solved. But after that $1 billion was gone, there was no corpus. There was nothing left. What if he had said, I'm going to give $1 billion, and if you're unsuccessful, you know what? I gave you a shot. But if you're successful, you're going to pay back some percentage of your income back into this pool that will create a perpetual endowment for future people from similar backgrounds to go to school. That $1 billion could have been a perpetual endowment to give students from disadvantaged backgrounds an opportunity at either college or workforce development for the next, for generations. And instead, I don't think we're going to give scholarship money anymore in 5 years. Like, if we're still doing scholarships the way we've been doing it for the last 100 years or 200 years, after 5 years of this ISA experimentation, shame on us, because we're wasting this renewable resource of people's talent and the ability of people to give back if they're successful.
I totally agree, Daniel. And I think, and we haven't been calling it ISAs, but there's a lot of examples of ISA, like similar pooled funding that look a lot like ISAs. For example, unions have something called union dues. And when you're on a job, your training is generally free to become an electrician through an apprenticeship model to a journeyman. And then when you get placed on a construction site, you have union dues, and a big portion of those union dues actually go back into the training fund for the people coming behind you. And if you're not on a job, you're not paying union dues that particular month. And so it's not that different than this idea of when your training is successful and you are making good money, you pay a portion forward. Another example is, I get called every couple of months I actually went to UC San Diego for my undergraduate degree, and I got a lot of value from my education. And so we get calls asking us to give back for a scholarship fund for people coming behind us. And the more value you got from your alma mater, the more likely you are to pay back. And so this idea of, if the program yields value, you pay something forward hasn't been called an ISA, but it's not necessarily in the training and higher education and training space. It's not a completely foreign concept.
Daniel, why don't we, I know philanthropy is something you think a lot about. Why don't we sort of zoom out and talk about what you talk about when you talk about innovating on philanthropy, the philanthropy in the arc of history. And, if we were all billionaires, what would be the biggest leverage points by which we could solve some of the problems you've been outlining?
Aren't we all billionaires, Eric? I thought that was next on the next podcast topic. Philanthropy in the United States is one of our great inventions as a country. And the largest single philanthropic grant in history up to that date occurred when a gentleman named Mr. Johns Hopkins donated money to what became the Johns Hopkins University. And at the time, it was an unprecedented amount of money. It was about $5 million. And he pioneered research universities in the United States. And the tech barons of the late 19th century, we now call them robber barons in retrospect. The tech barons of the 19th century were the people who started America's great research universities. Universities like MIT, Carnegie Mellon University, Stanford University, right? Leland Stanford, Carnegie and Mellon families, University of Chicago with the Rockefeller family. These families came together and created the great universities of the 20th century. And as this generation of tech wealth that is unprecedented, or the only precedent that we have for the amount of the concentration of wealth in technology and disruptive technology is happening today. And this generation is starting to give away that level of wealth. When they're looking at higher education, they're being remarkably traditional in how they're giving away their wealth. You're looking at people like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and not just them, but Ken Langone and other people doing things like funding traditional scholarships, funding traditional institutions that the last generation of extremely wealthy entrepreneurs and leaders in their communities created. And it's actually disappointing, right? The people who are so brilliant and have so remade society in their image aren't doing the creative donations that their predecessors did. And actually, I mentioned it when I talked about the Millennium Scholarship Grant that Bill Gates did. This $1 billion, this amazing amount of largesse, and so the giving pledges. And instead of creating something that really had a sustainable impact, that really disrupted education, it really was given in a way that was a one-shot deal. And 20 years from now, no one's going to really remember it except for a few lucky participants. And think of the impact of that versus giving $1 billion to create a new type of institution, maybe a new type of workforce training that instituted the union pay it forward concept to bring people into the 21st century of coding knowledge that Andy just described as an alternative use case for that kind of money. And we're seeing increasingly the rich in the higher education ecosystem getting richer, right? Something like over 50% of donations to higher education are donated to something like 50 schools. That's not what you would think would come out of the great, titans of Silicon Valley. And so, I think that as we look at what we can do to improve how we give philanthropically, income share agreements, pioneering income share agreements could become an area where you redefine what it means to give. I mean, Eric Schmidt, I believe, I think it's the Google Foundation, Eric Schmidt. Andy, who's funding your workforce program development?
I was just about to jump in. I do think philanthropy has an opportunity to redefine how workforce development certainly works and is more aligned to outcomes versus inputs. And so our fund, I should give some specifics here. So we have a $3.25 million fund and we're looking to grow it. But right now we have 4 philanthropic investors who have underwritten the fund. The first that came in was $1.2 million from the Strata Education Network. We got a $1.2 million investment or grant, I should say, from the James Irvine Foundation. And then we had Google.org came in with $450,000, and then an individual philanthropist here in San Diego invested $500,000. And so that got us to 3.25, if I'm doing my math right. And it has really transformed the conversation about how we provide value to our customers. And we serve, again, 25,000 a year, and has the potential to have ripple effects all across the country with the 550 workforce boards that we work with. Many of them have reached out, asked what we're doing, how we did it, how we raised the money, how we partnered with UCSD. And currently, we have every dollar that comes back to us less some servicing fees. goes back into the fund to pay it forward, because none of those investors are looking for any kind of return. Now, our long-term vision is to have about $10 million of philanthropic capital kind of taking first loss, with a larger fund of up to $25 million of assets, with $15 million being social impact or even commercial investment, that you can imagine kind of a tranched capital stack that offers still very friendly terms to consumers, while delivering very good returns to both social impact and commercial investors. And that will fundamentally transform the way that we create opportunity in San Diego. And so I think that would have, as philanthropy digs in with on the skills-based learning side, I think that will have fundamental impacts on how the federal government looks at public workforce investments, focuses it on outcomes, and focuses it on kind of longer-term sustainability.
Yeah, we want to diversify our tech workforce, our healthcare workforce, across the board. We're facing these issues of diversity, inclusion, financial inclusion. And you just heard someone who's on the front line say, look, $3 million redefined workforce in one county. You could, one of these like grants, one of these, donations, these donations being made to traditional universities to like endow a school would fundamentally reshape the landscape of the world of work. And so, and in a way that's evergreen, right? That would forever perpetuate this new model of paying it forward. And so I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, and let me take 5 minutes, if that's okay, maybe less, and just unpack our program a little bit more. So what that has done, that philanthropic investment has done, is it's going to fund the coursework for 500 individuals over the next 3 years to get into tech careers. And we have partnered, our training partner is UC San Diego Extension. And the 4 programs that we're focusing on to start with are digital marketing, business intelligence, Java programming, and front-end web design. We are the counterparty to the ISA. We're originating the ISA as a 501c3 nonprofit. And then once folks have passed a competency assessment to get into the course at UCSD, we then have a performance-based subcontract with UCSD that aligns their payments with the same kind of incentive structure that the ISA has, meaning that they don't get paid in full until the student's successful. The face value of the ISA for us is $6,500, and that includes both 9 to 12 month certificate programs at UCSD, depending on the program, as well as what we do best, which is job placement and wraparound support. So we have a career coach dedicated to every single one of the students that helps them land internships and jobs, but also helps them access transportation, childcare, food stamps vouchers if they need nutritional assistance, helps them with housing because some of the individuals are housing insecure. And the terms of the ISA are 5 to 8% is the income share for between 36 and 48 months, depends on the program. And we have a minimum income threshold of $40,000, meaning that if someone's not coming out of the program making $40,000, they have no obligation. And so those terms are, we think, will both create a lot of value for the fund and also are very consumer friendly for the customers that we serve. And to double down on what Daniel just said about access and inclusion, our cohort of students, the first 50 have started. We had 450 applications for these 50 slots with very little marketing. And so, like I said before, this idea that students are not being asked to take all the financial risks for their upskilling really resonates. That's what I mean. We sent 1 or 2 emails out to our network of individuals who have been unemployed in San Diego County over the last year. And 450 people signed up and took the assessments. We have kind of gone through the selection process, and the individuals in these technology programs in cohort 1 are not the typical students that UCSD extension professors get. They usually get kind of white collar workers who are already in jobs at some of our large tech companies here, who their employer is paying for them to get this or that certificate so they can go from making $100,000 to $120,000. But our cohort is a completely different demographic for the students or for the UCSD professors. They have all passed the same competency assessment. That means that they can be successful in the program. And so we've underwritten the ISAs not on pedagogy, where someone went to school, or maybe a better way to say it with the folks we serve. where someone could afford to go to school, but actually, can they do the job and can they be successful in the role? So that's what we've kind of underwritten our ISAs on competency. And then the students that are in the cohort are 70% people of color. We have about 50-50 women and men. About 35 of the individuals are on CalFresh, or formerly known as food stamps, and about 65% qualify. So that's something we'll be doing, is getting folks signed up so that they have food. And some are working, many are not. But the course was designed around kind of someone working in kind of retail or the tourism industry, which is big in San Diego. And we actually have a few folks with master's degrees, a couple bachelor's degrees. The majority have kind of some college who are in the program. And like I said, kind of with this network of wraparound support, we'll be having kind of regular hosted events that kind of correspond with the coursework to build a sense of social capital. Because one thing that we know from our research, these folks can do the classroom work. They've shown that through their competency assessment. They haven't accessed some of these jobs, not because of competency, but because of lack of opportunity and lack of social capital. So the opportunity is financed by the ISA. And then what we do is we're connecting them with the business and the corporate network to kind of be the country club for people who don't have country clubs, and to connect them with hiring managers and businesses and get them informational interviews and that kind of thing, which, as all of us know, are sometimes just as important to landing that job than whether or not you can pass the test. So that's kind of how our ISA is structured. And I left off a few details here and there, but overall, that's the kind of what we've built. And that was all underwritten by philanthropy. I will say kind of we have a few areas where we want to look in the forward where we think ISAs play a role. One is with new Americans. So San Diego has a lot of both refugees, but also just traditional immigrants. And one story, there's a woman who came to our center who was a nurse in Mexico. And San Diego has a huge shortage for bilingual Spanish-speaking nurses. And they pay a lot of money, but it takes some time and about $9,000 to get your credentials to translate. But if you're here newly from Mexico, you don't have $9,000 in your pocket, perhaps, and though this person didn't. And so how do you finance that credential translation process, which takes some classes and to do some paperwork with the state? We think an ISA has some potential there. Secondly, I mentioned the union area. Third, I think there's drone aviation is a big area of growth in San Diego, but there's no courses that really teach drone aviation. And so working with some drone businesses around ISAing, some on-the-job training / apprenticeship programs is another frontier. And then certainly healthcare, I mentioned briefly, but all of the other healthcare areas that we're hurting for is an area of feasibility for us going forward. So yeah, philanthropy has catalyzed all that activity, and I think we can do more.
One thing you mentioned earlier, Daniel, you double-clicked on was this idea of the customer. And I was watching this the deposition the conversation between AOC and David Marcus about Libra yesterday. And one thing AOC asked David Marcus, which is, should currency be a public good? And David Marcus basically avoided the question. How do you think about it in the context of, I guess, higher education, or just education broadly, at the higher level, the sort of private, public, like, should the students be the customer? And if so, what are the implications of that?
So I think there's a big difference, first of all, between workforce development and sort of education, from the Latin educare, to lead out of darkness. But I think that historically we considered higher education a public good. And if you look at the history of higher education in the United States, it really started in a modern sense with the Morrill Land Grant Act, where literally the government gave land to start the state university systems. And state governments have been funding education for a very long time, hundreds of years, with the explicit understanding that they would create economic development. And that's really what's happening today, where the justification for education is economic development. But at the same time, states are cutting back on their funding because they're not quite getting what they're asking for. They're getting political problems, depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on. And the reality is education is both. It's both a public good, but also something people pay for. And as states are pulling back from their funding, as the federal government is transitioning its funding from grants and direct subsidy to loans that are ultimately paid back, hopefully, or expected to be paid back by the consumer, you're switching from a public good to a private. And when you make that transition, it's filled with the types of debates you're hearing today. And I think it's terribly irresponsible, although understandable, in light of the situation, that you have, basically a lot of members of Congress and senators and even other political leaders sort of attacking universities on political grounds. But at the end of the day, where people have decided to fund universities is for economic development. And so there is this belief that it should be a public good. But the reality is we fund it like a private good. And so the debate actually happened. We decided to defund universities, right? The University of Alaska just had a 43% haircut in their funding. Most state universities had 50, 60% funding cuts. Arizona, the San Diego Workforce Board, Andy just walked through, 20% funding levels from where it was. So we've made the decision by our funding priorities that we're going to transition this to be a private good. We absolutely have to figure out a mechanism to fund that isn't student debt, that is totally disconnected from outcomes. We need to transition to a type of funding that looks a lot more like an income share agreement, where we have a sense for what the outcomes are, and those outcomes are tied to actual economic results, because that's why people are really going to school.
And I think, businesses, and we just saw Amazon invest how many millions, 700 million, or at least announce their investment of lots of money for about 100,000 of their employees or so around upskilling. I think I'll just speak for, the public workforce system. If we don't adapt and create value for every dollar, like really align our services to value for customers, I would imagine if I was a corporate leader, I would begin taking big steps like Amazon just announced to work around the public upskilling system. And I think there's a way for those two things to work together. But then if corporate leaders continue to more and more work around the public workforce system, I think we're going to continue to see, and the education system, we're going to continue to see people being left behind, because those who will continue to have more, who are already connected to these investments, and to those who aren't will continue to fall further behind. And we will just accelerate this trend towards kind of a low-skilled, stuck underclass without much economic mobility for them. And what's more troubling to me increasingly is for their children. So I do think there can be a both conversation in there. And I think what's critical is that, since as Daniel mentioned, if we've decided that we're treating this as a private good, then the services have to be aligned towards outcomes. And we need some guardrails, kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation, around consumer protections, access, and inclusion.
The most interesting piece to this debate is you have university professors and presidents saying, we don't want to train people for jobs. And the reaction to that is going to be Amazon, where Amazon says, you know what, guys, I'm going to take this over and I'm going to train people for jobs, and so the universities are going to miss out. And in this debate between public and private good, as I said, the decision's been made because the universities overwhelmingly said, hey, we don't want to do that. And the mistake there is that the funding is going to go away from traditional universities towards these alternative providers. And we think one of the most interesting things that's developing right now are sort of intermediaries that are trying to allocate skill and capital between sort of colleges and universities, which have so many, and workforce boards and people leaving the military have so much raw talent. And on the other hand, you've got 7 million unfilled jobs. And we think there's going to be a new generation, and a lot of what we're funding right now is a new generation of intermediaries between the colleges and sort of their amazing talent and their diverse talent, but that's not getting placed in the jobs that they want to do. We have this chasm between education and employment, and it's incredibly sad to see. But I think there needs to develop almost like the apprenticeship model. We're not going to get an apprenticeship model in the U.S. like we have in Europe, but we are going to see, I think, a U.S. equivalent of sort of outsourced apprenticeships to a new generation of groups that are using income share agreements, employer pay models, working with workforce boards to serve as an actual physical plated pathway from education to employment.
Peter Thiel has been perhaps one of the most famous, critics of higher education. You're calling it a bubble. I guess. Well, let me ask you: could you outline what you think are his most salient critiques, and then where do you sympathize or not or differ from those critiques?
Peter basically says people should drop out of college, and college is worthless. And I think when you're in these rooms of think tanks and policy discussions and investors, everybody went to Stanford. And everybody, most people, unfortunately, and this is a subject for a different podcast I'm sure you're going to run one day, Eric. Unfortunately, economic mobility is not what we would like it to be in this country. And regardless of whether there are very, 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 very few Bill Gateses and Peter Thiels and these amazing people out there, and I'm not one of them. And for the vast majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people, getting a college degree is probably the single best investment they will ever make in their life. And so I think it's irresponsible overall to say, don't go to school, drop out. Conversely, he's onto something in that, schools aren't doing what they're saying they're going to do, right? Remember we said only 25% of people are getting a good outcome from going to school and 75% are not. And so, we really need to take a more nuanced look at, and I think the income share agreements start allocating risk better, right? Because you start saying, okay, this school has a better outcome because they're able to offer a cheaper ISA or they're able to show better job outcomes. And that's the stuff that Andy's talking about from a workforce perspective. And so we need to do a much better, more nuanced job of giving people better information to make better decisions where the return on their investment is really high in certain programs and less so in others. And so I think, where the Thiel doctrine sort of works is for this like 0.0001% of people who are autodidacts and Bill Gates and, figure out how to code Python on their own. But for the rest of us mere mortals, higher education is generally a good thing. And we should be focused more on sort of making the system work with more faster and cheaper pathways to employment than sort of blowing up the system.
I have such a personal conflict because, we preach these middle skill jobs, we as an organization, and we do the research, and there's really good jobs, being a welder and, being a nurse, and like these jobs that don't require a 4-year degree that pay really well and you can skip the debt. But I'm about to become a father. My wife's due in about a month now, and we're gonna name our daughter Hadley. And when Hadley grows up, unless something changes, I'm going to say, you're going to a 4-year school. And so, even on a very personal level, I'm in this profession, but I still have a mindset of a 4-year school is the best. And I think where I'm arriving to is the Stanfords and the Harvards, and those are one thing, you're buying into a network and that buying into that network, as I understand, without even looking at the data, seems to be paying off for a lot of people. But for most schools, I think it will work, and I think it still is probably the best investment in both yourself and your future career if you know up front kind of what you're trying to get out of it, and you're walking into the decision point about how you're financing it and where you're going with some eyes wide open about what your strengths, your interests, your values are, and how those strengths, interests, and values kind of line up to career options in your area or an area you'd like to move, and how that school can get you there and at what cost. I mean, right now, I just think about my own experience. I didn't have any of those things squared away, and I signed up for UC San Diego, and it was a great choice, and I never go back. And I had no idea what I was doing and what I was going to be paying through student loans. And so it's such a conflicting conversation for so many of us personally. But I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. How do we prepare young people growing up to really get squared away on their strengths, interests, and values and where they want to go before signing on the dotted line that locks them into perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, where the school is not necessarily the school that they've selected gets that money no matter what outcomes the student has before, during, or after their education experience.
Why doesn't Harvard or Stanford accept 5x more, 10x more student? What are the limitations on that, given it's such a great experience for people who go to such great school?
Oh, come on. If they did that, they wouldn't be elite anymore. And then you wouldn't want to send your kids there because it's not elite. Don't you know anything about elitism? And this is Silicon Valley. This is a podcast. Everybody wants to be elite. If you let everybody in, what are we going to do?
Right. Okay.
No, and look, to be clear, though, right, the university is a sacred institution. In our society as a whole, besides the Catholic Church, the university is the second oldest institution we have as a culture and as a society. The first university was founded in 1088. You have the great Eastern universities. The first Western university was founded in 1088 in Bologna. That's the first. You have these great, academic traditions. They're different, but they evolved around the world. Almost every great society around the world has sort of like an academic tradition. And there's something amazing about that. Up until about 75 years ago, though, 80 years ago, only like 1% of the population went to universities. We've done this amazing thing. We've expanded access to higher education to millions of people, expanded to 30, 40% of the population. But maybe there's sort of a median point where, yes, for people who are ready to go through higher education, they're going to it. But for a lot of people, the better option is to take a faster, cheaper pathway to an actual job, and then start thinking about lifelong learning. I worked for 15 years on the Cisco router Q4353, and now it's out of service. I'm going to go back to the workforce board. I'm going to upgrade my skills to cloud computing, and I'm going to get a job, being a Amazon, DevOps guy. I mean, so the rate of technological change is accelerating for what we would call a blue collar or even, halfway between or even white collar experience. You need skills today. I mean, this is the underlying fact that we haven't talked about yet. In order to get a job today, you need skills. You need to know software packages. You need to know things that you didn't need to know 30 years ago for a job. And universities aren't set up to do that. Universities are set up to educate. They're not set up to teach people software packages. 30 years ago, to get a job as a salesperson, you went up, showed up, said, hey, I can sell you something, and a company would train you to sell. Today, if you don't know Salesforce.com, you can't get a job as a salesperson. It's like the sine qua non. It's like to get that job, you need, and there's a whole set of reasons where, there are only so many ways you can say, hey, happy personality. At the end of the day, everybody who's hiring for sales positions wants you to know either HubSpot or Salesforce.com. Go to every single college campus. You ask every single university, college, or community college president, are you teaching Salesforce.com? I bet you less than 1% are doing that. Something has to develop that at scale will train millions of people in this country on Salesforce.com. There are 300,000 open Salesforce positions today. That pathway to employment needs to exist. We need to figure out how to do it. And the best financing mechanism to do that is an income share agreement, I believe.
Perhaps my last comment, but I think the income share agreement on the front, I think someone mentioned, Daniel, I think you mentioned that the student loan decision is probably the biggest piece of debt and their biggest investment that people will make in their life, maybe besides the home that they buy. Although, millennials like me have delayed buying homes because we have so much student debt, but that's another conversation. But we're taking on these loans, we're taking on this debt before we know what we want to do on the other side, and also without any kind of financial literacy training, unless we were one of the lucky few who our parents taught us some things about basic finance, personal finance. And kind of the shocking thing about the student loan crisis is kind of combined with the kind of bankrupt state of our financial literacy. And the thing about ISAs that is both interesting but also concerns me is that I think ISA offerings need to be paired with some pretty rigorous financial coaching and literacy so that people know what they're signing themselves up for, which, by the way, isn't happening with student loans now. So it's not like we're going backwards. But it also forces the conversation about, oh, how much do you think I'll make after I graduate? Oh, what job? That job this degree leads to these types of jobs that make $55,000 an hour or $55,000 a year. And I'll pay back how much? 7%? Okay, you do some math, and you actually, if you're an 18-year-old or, a 25-year-old, you're actually starting to think about personal finance in a different way. And I think that's really, really important before people sign up for what, for many of us, is going to be the biggest liability that we ever take on. And I think the only people doing real personal finance training across the country systematically is the banks, is because they have to. And that's, to me, that's insane. That's like McDonald's teaching nutrition classes. So adding to the student loan crisis, this idea of very little financial literacy and personal finance training is a very scary thing. And in the context of the ISA, it's super important that anyone offering ISAs take it upon themselves from a moral perspective to make sure people know what they're signing themselves up to and force the conversation before they allow people to sign. That's something that we did. And I will just add that it's not something that's happening with student loans. I mean, when I signed up for my student loan, I didn't really know what I was signing up for. I just got into school and people told me that you take out loans to pay for it. And so I did.
Warmer sense to both of your time. This is a good note to end on. My guests have been Daniel Pianko and Andy Hall. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.